Well, if you would, you have your Bibles, turn to Matthew chapter 7. We're staying in Matthew, but we're starting a new series. For many, many weeks, we have said, hey, turn to Matthew, a particular chapter, and we've said, what if Jesus was serious? Matthew chapter 9, what if he was serious about our thoughts? Matthew 6, what if he was serious about our prayers? Matthew 12, what if he was serious about our words? And Matthew 25, what if he was serious about our actions? Staying in Matthew, but starting a new series, and this series is going to be about storms. We're going to talk about the rains and the winds and the house being pummeled. We're going to talk about what that means. And today's sermon title is called Before the Storm. And as you're turning to Matthew chapter 7, I want to show you I want to give a shout out to someone who's watching from home today. This is, are we ready up there? Not ready? It's a real special person, or creature, I should say. Oh. We don't have him. All right, well, we'll get to it in a second. We'll try. Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 to 28. I think we have the passage. Is the screen, are we working? There we go. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain fell, the rivers rose, and the winds blew and pounded that house, yet it didn't collapse because its foundation was on the rock. I know some of you are yawning. You've heard this story. Stay with us. But everyone who hears these words of mine and doesn't act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, the rivers rose, the winds blew and pounded that house, and it collapsed. It collapsed with a great crash. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were astonished at his teaching. He was one, they said, that had authority. He didn't teach as the scribes and the Pharisees, the other religious people. He taught as one who had authority. Can we just say that learning is important? It's why we educate our children. We buy them educational toys to stimulate their imagination, to develop their cognitive abilities and their motor skills, to advance their socialization and their communication skills. We drag them to tutors and lessons. We put up their artwork on the refrigerator, even though it's not exactly Picasso. We celebrate words they say that aren't even really words, sounds they say that aren't even words. Education, learning, is very important. I've heard it said that teaching, at its best, is an act of love. Socrates, before he died, had pupils. He had people around him, and on his deathbed, they surrounded him. There was a ring of people surrounding him, expressing their love because they knew that he loved them, that his teaching represented this act of love. We're inspired, moved, and stirred by movies like Dead Poet Society and Mr. Holland's Opus. If you know the life of Helen Keller, her soul was awakened and stirred by a teacher named Anne Sullivan. Teaching does more than just catalog facts and pass on information. Teaching moves us, and teaching transports us into a different world. And in the teachings of Jesus, we see this in chapter 7 and verse 28. They were astonished at his teachings because he spoke, verse 29, as one who had authority. There was something in Jesus where we see his intellectual stature. We see this pure genius of Jesus in his teachings. His teachings made sense. They rang true. They lined up with the nature of reality in our world today. And we see this. Jesus knew the power of teaching in and of itself, the power of his teaching. He knew that fishermen that would cast a net, casters of nets in the Sea of Galilee, he knew that they could go on to become fishers of men. He knew sowers of seed could one day learn about being laborers in the harvest. He knew that people who sought out treasure one day could find the great treasure worth great price. He knew this. So his teaching wasn't just passing on information or cataloging facts. He was transporting people to a different world. So this very familiar story, and you know this is a story that's inspired books and movies and even songs, and there's a best-selling book that you read to your children, and maybe some of you even had it read to you, Three Little Pigs. And this story, three pigs, similar to the two men in this story, they built a house, right? One built with hay and straw, and one built with sticks, and one built with bricks. But to all three, the big bad wolf showed up at the door, and he made this real innocent plea for entry. And they made a defiant response. They said, what? Not by the hair on my chinny chin chin. The big bad wolf wanted in, and they prevented him, right? Or part of the story, you know how it goes. And there's this just a motivation of this story that Jesus told that has inspired other stories. And I want us to look at it today in 3 parts. Sermon title, Before the Storm, Matthew 7, 24 to 28. And part 1, for our perspective today, is this. It's construction. Part 1 is construction. And this is the house. It's a pretty simple truth that we miss in our day. And it's just something, and it's why we need teachers. It's why we need God's Word. It's why we need to gather. It's why we need to circle up, because we can miss what's obvious. We can miss spiritual truths. We don't discern. By the way, when Jesus told a parable, the people who had the spiritual antennas, they understood it, and those that didn't were lost with the parables. So Jesus tells us this story. He says there's construction happening, and this was a business he knew about. He told many parables, but this was one particularly familiar with him because he was a carpenter. He was more than a carpenter, but he was a carpenter. He would later take over for his dad's business as an independent contractor, so he knew a little bit about construction. Part 1 of this story is construction. This is the house. Everybody is building a house, but few people think of what type of house they're building. It's part of our human nature, our fallenness, that we run through life without really thinking about it. There's a type of house that you can build where the house is about you. It's what you want. You want the house to point to you, and you want people to think highly of you. It's after all, your house, and it's the house that you're building. Genesis 11:4 captures early on we see our flaws, and we see someone building. We see a group of people building, and they said, come, let's build ourselves a city, a bunch of houses, and a tower with its top in the sky. Let's make a name for ourselves. Let's make a name. Let's build something, and let's make a name for ourselves. Many of us do that. All of us are tempted to do this. Maybe we don't have the out front external arrogance to make that declaration in front of people, but quietly we could be wanting to build something for ourselves, to make a name for ourselves. What kind of house are you building? Everybody is building a house, but what type of house are you building? We're indicted, I think, by not thinking about the construction, not thinking about partnering with God and building the type of house, the type of soul, the type of life, the type of character that He would have for us. Yesterday, I drove out to do a wedding. Yesterday afternoon, such a pretty day, and I was going down a 4-lane. The 4-lane turned 2-lane. I got down to Braxton and Star, and the 2-lane pavement turned to dirt. And then I started thinking, man, I'm gonna hear the Deliverance banjos if I keep going here. But I gotta get to my destination. So I didn't want to hear the banjos, but I turned up some music. The windows were down because it was a wintry day in Mississippi, 83 degrees. And so I was listening to Kenny Chesney sing at the time. Right before I pulled up to the venue, I had confidence. You look at your phone when you're still, and you look at your phone and you realize you got it. You don't need it anymore because that stuff drains some battery power, and I didn't have my charger. But I just turn on. I knew I was there pretty much, and I had the radio on, and Kenny Chesney is singing the song "Just to Say We Did." And this song goes a little bit like this, song from last year. We drove from Knoxville to Myrtle Beach, 7 buddies in an old RV, a beer cooler and no AC, just to say we did. That night we climbed up Chimney Rock, knowing it would be a real long drop. 3, 2, 1, and we jumped off, just to say we did. Never had no rhyme or reason why. It just seemed like the thing to do at the time, just to say we did. Just to say we did, just to feel alive, to take a leap of faith, to feel that kind of high. Well, with the windows turned up, I thought, man, that's a good philosophy. In some ways, my life is lined up to that. Let's live an adventure, man. Let's just do things just to say we did. But as a philosophy of life, it can be selfish. It can be similar to building a tower, to constructing a house that's about ourselves. Just to say we did is a common philosophy of life. And so Jesus wants us to think about what type of house you're building. Paul, inspired, radically changed by the teachings and the life of Jesus Christ, would write a letter to the church at Corinth. He would write 2. Some people believe more than 2, but we have 2 reserved for us. And in the 3rd chapter of the first letter to Corinth, he talks about building. And he says, be careful what you're building. Because some people build on wood, hay, and straw. And some people build on something more solid. Be careful how you're building. Part 1 is construction. What kind of house are you building? Don't just walk through life not thinking about your worldview and your philosophy and what's shaping you. Everybody believes in something, and the default mode, I believe, for many of us is just to do things just to say we did, to make our lives about ourselves. What kind of house are you building? Can I just say every choice that I make, every friendship that I enter, every promise that I keep or break, every talent and gift that God gives me that I cultivate or neglect, that's a part of my house. That's a part of the house that I'm building, and that's true of you as well. Part one is construction, that's the house. Part two is disruption. And this is the storm. This is what's common. Writer Earl Palmer says when there's certain stories that are told that you see first what they have in common, and then you see where they differ. And it's in where they differ is the intended point of the story. But construction is common. Disruption, unfortunately, kids, is common. This is one we don't want to be true. When we gather, we gather to edify the believers. We gather to strengthen each other. We gather to worship God. We gather to learn. We gather to be inspired. We gather to fellowship with one another and mooch off the church's free coffee. We gather for many different reasons. We hear the word and we're hopefully inspired by the word and we're changed by the word. That's the goal. But one of the things I think we fail to realize, and I think I mentioned this a couple times over the last several months, but part of what when we gather is to learn and help each other, ready for this, suffer well. We're called to help each other suffer well. Job 14 and verse 1 says this, nobody puts this on a coffee cup. Anyone born of woman is short of days and full of trouble. What kind of reaction would you get if you put that on the bumper sticker of your car and drove down Lakeland? Man, it's not going to inspire people, but it's true, isn't it? Anyone born, all of us have trauma. All of us have trouble, and we can't avoid it. But let me say, I had the opportunity this week to interact with some folks, and we talked about this. There is some trouble that you can avoid. There are some storms that we don't have to have in our lives. There's some rains that fall, some rivers that rise, some winds that whip, some houses that our house gets pounded, but it doesn't have to. So, for some wisdom, let's go to Proverbs 22:3, and it says this. We need this, I need this. A sensible person, I like to think I've grown out of this, but I haven't. A sensible person sees danger and takes cover. That's storm language, isn't it? Take cover, batten down the hatches, be careful. A sensible person sees danger and takes cover, but the inexperienced, the simple-minded, they keep going and they're punished. There are some things that you can bring on yourself, some storms you can bring on that you don't have to. If you're lazy, Proverbs tells us, you could come to poverty and you could come to ruin. 1 Peter chapter 4 tells me as a husband, if I'm not kind to my wife and sensitive to her, if I'm not a student of her and live with her in an understanding way, then God won't hear my prayers. There are all kind of things in the Bible, promises you could even say, that we need to cling to. And if we don't, we're not being wise, we're being foolish. And so for everybody, this is a plea for us to be sensible. This is a plea for us to realize that some of our trouble and trauma, it's self-induced. And we need each other. Proverbs 15:22. Plans fail for a lack of counsel, but with many counselors, we can succeed. The people around us, a circle of people who know us and love us, they're not in all of us. They don't have us up on a pedestal. They honor us and appreciate us, but they know us and they're worshiping God, not us, and they can point out things that we need. We need that, and we can avoid so much. I wonder what kind of storms are self-inflicted in your life. What kind of waves have you invited and brought in just because you haven't taken cover? You haven't, when you see the danger, you just keep going. And there's a really important word that we need, and that word is stop. There's some things that we're doing, things you're doing in your marriage, things you're doing with your parenting and in your relationships at work. Stop. It's not good. There's danger ahead. There's consequences that are going to have to be paid. There's the law of reaping and sowing, and it's just as true in our lives as it is for the farmer. In fact, Galatians 6 says, God is not mocked. What we sow, we're going to reap. And so let's be careful not to invite storms into our lives. And now let's back up and enter back into the story and realize that what Jesus is saying here in Matthew 7 is very similar to what Job said in Job 14:1. There's just some stuff we're not going to be able to avoid. In John chapter 3, Jesus is talking. Stay with me because I'm taking something over here and lining it up with something over here. But Jesus said that the work of the Spirit, that's a good thing. The work of the Holy Spirit, we need more of that in our lives, in our church. The work of the Holy Spirit, he said, is like the wind. We don't know where it's coming from or where it's going. And that's a good thing. It's hard for planners to think about that. If you have your plans all laid out, hey, the work of the Spirit, you don't know where the work of the Spirit's coming from or where it's going. And that meant more to them in those days because they didn't have the Weather Channel. We do. And we can predict more than they could. But that's a shocking statement about the work of the Spirit. We don't know where it's going. We don't know when it's coming. We don't know what it's going to do. And you take that and parallel it with trouble, with storms, and the same can be said for storms. That's probably one of the big problems about storms in our lives is we don't know when they're coming. And I want to ask you, would you want to know when the storms are coming? Based on Proverbs 22:3, you would, because you could see the trouble and you could maybe take cover. But we're talking about the storms you can't see coming, and even if you could, you couldn't do much about it. You couldn't do anything about it. There's those type of storms that happen to us. Jesus made this promise, even a prediction in the Sermon on the Mount. That's where we are. If you back up to Matthew chapter 6, and you know this, he says, don't worry about tomorrow. You remember what he said after that? Don't worry about tomorrow, because what? Tomorrow's got worries in and of itself. You need your energy for today. Jesus is promising this: trouble today, trouble tomorrow. That's what he said. Trouble today, trouble tomorrow. And that's a prediction. Let me ask you, is that a true prediction? Trouble today. Anybody had some trouble today? Anybody gonna have some trouble today? Anybody gonna have some trouble tomorrow? That's a prediction, and it's true. Jesus said it. I'm always gonna go with him, but it's true, and we have empirical data all around us to say it's true. Jesus' prediction in Matthew 6 is true in the Sermon on the Mount. Trouble today, trouble tomorrow. When we were interacting with this passage, this parable as a staff this week in my office, Laura McAlpin said, the older I get, and Laura's real young, weird that she said that, but she said, the older I get, the less I'm worried about the storms and the more I'm focused on peace. And that's a good point to think about, to have a good, healthy perspective to think about, because there's some storms coming. Man, honestly, I don't want to know. I need to live in today. And to try to predict and to try to work and control, that's an exercise in futility. But to have peace, to focus on Jesus, to think about the foundation. Man, we're all in the construction business. The carpenter tells us that. He's more than a carpenter, but he's a carpenter, and he's telling us that we're all building something. That's our house. But then there's disruption, and that's the storms that come to us. So I want to point us now to the third part of this story, and that's part 3, the foundation. Think with me, let's move from a house to the classroom. Every student, unless you're auditing the class, every student has to face examination day. I've heard somebody say that in school you learn the lesson and take the test, but in life you have the test and you learn the lesson. But stay with me in the classroom. When you're taking an exam, examination day is coming, and what's it going to do? It's going to make apparent, it's going to reveal what's already known or not known by that student. There's not a lot you can do once you sit down in front of the examination. There's probably not a lot of new knowledge that you're going to gain in that moment. It's just testing you to see what's already inside of you. Can you recall it? Do you know it? Did you grasp the material? And in some ways, if you think about a teacher, because we see in Matthew 7, before the storm, we see Jesus the teacher. But a teacher doesn't seek to spare the student from the test, but to prepare the student for the test. And so that's what we need to be thinking about. It's the call today. It's the essence of the teaching today as we talk in these next few weeks about the storms of life. We want to focus today on before the storm. We are called to gather and worship. We're called to edify other believers. We're called to be involved in making disciples. We say here at Fondren, borrowing from Galatians 5:6, the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. All that's very important, and one of the components of this is to help each other with the disruptions of life, to help each other suffer well, to help each other get through it. So preparation comes. It's a part of it, and it's going to reveal. And that's what disruption does. Man, when it's 75 degrees and there's no humidity and no bugs around and you're living in San Diego about to go surfing, man, that's not going to reveal who you are, is it? If you're right here and all the bills are paid and your teeth are shiny white and your family loves you and things are going well at work, you just got a promotion with a pay raise, that's not going to reveal really who you are. It's going to be through the disruptions of your life. And remember, these 4 things that Jesus says is in his story happened to both people. We're still at the common point of the story, and the construction and the disruption. Jesus says the rains fell, the rivers rose, the winds blew, and the house was pounded. But it's the foundation where we see what's different. I shared with you, it's a great thing to read later. 1 Corinthians 13 in many ways parallels Matthew chapter 7, this part of the Sermon on the Mount. And there's 2 expressions in the 3rd chapter of 1 Corinthians. I isolated them. And it says this in Corinthians, the 3rd chapter. It talks about this being revealed. You have that up there? One day, there's 2 little quotes, 2 little expressions. We may be stuck up top. There's 2 little expressions. Here we go. Each one's work will become obvious, for the day will disclose it. It will be revealed. So we need to be thinking about our preparation. We need to be thinking about our construction. We need to not focus on it, but we need to understand the realities of the disruption in our lives, because it's going to be revealed. When you sit down and take a test, that teacher, out of love, when you face examination day, it's revealing what's already been manifest. It's going to reveal that. And so are the disruptions in our lives. So the difference in the story, to go back to what Earl Palmer says, this is the intended point of Jesus' story. There's a difference. And Jesus said one person is wise and help me, church. One person is wise and one person is foolish. And I believe, as I've studied this parable, I have through the years honed in on it this week, knowing I was preaching, obviously. But I believe Jesus used this word with surgical precision. He doesn't say wicked person. He doesn't say wise person and wicked person. He says foolish person. I'm convinced that the person in this story did what is right in his own eyes. I'm convinced that they thought it was the sensible thing to do. I don't know. I know a few architects. I love architects. I appreciate what they do. Being a pastor in this old building for so many years, I love architects. And I don't know an architect alive that would say, hey, there's a bunch of sand over there. Let's build a house on it. That'd be a great idea. No architect is going to do that. I don't know anybody that says, man, I'm going to have children and I'm going to be so busy at work that I'm not going to have ever any time to be with them. I don't know anybody that goes into something saying, hey, I want this to fail. This wasn't a wicked person who deliberately said, I'm going to ruin my life. I mean, who does that? This is someone who just thought in the moment it was the sensible thing to do, maybe just to say we did. Parents will ask their kids a question when their kids have done something foolish. When they'll ask a question, hey, Junior, why did you write on the wall with that permanent marker? Hey, little gal, little daughter, why did you stick that spaghetti noodle up your brother's nose? Why did you do this? And they're asking it's a futile search for meaning and logic and rationality when there's no meaning, or logic, or rationality involved. The kid always says in that moment, I don't know. If they can't get out of it, they'll say, I don't know. It just seemed like the right thing to do. And I think in Jesus' story, this is not someone with meaning, rational and logic. This is someone it just seemed like the right thing to do. So Jesus said there's a wise person and there's a foolish person. No one sets out to wreck their lives. And what's the difference, okay? Part 1, construction, that's the house. Part 2, disruption, that's the storm. Part 3, the foundation. That's when you know what you're made of. And the difference is really the foundation. It's what they built their life on. And what does Jesus say is the difference? Do you already know? You came here today knowing this parable? Or can you recall it from what we just read on the screen? The difference is what? One who just hears the word and one who does the word. And this is important. There are immense practical applications, but I think that we miss the gospel by focusing too much on this doing. Now, it's really important. In fact, I said here last week in a different sermon that in the Bible Belt, so many of us can say, this could be your story, man, I sing the songs and I hear the sermon, but there's so little life change and growth in my life. And I said from here, it's the difference between hearing the word and doing the word. And doing the word is really important. Could you imagine going to a doctor or a lawyer or a counselor or someone and you're getting an expert's advice, like they're good at what they do, and you listen to him or her and they tell you what to do, and you leave their office and you don't do it? Imagine someone who goes to that doctor, lawyer, counselor, someone, and they hear the expert give them advice and they go do it. That's a huge difference, isn't it, between someone who does something and doesn't do something about it. So that's immensely true in this story, but let's back up and know the context. I've said it several times this morning. This is the end. In fact, we could tack on verse 29, but these are the last verses of the Sermon on the Mount. And you may know that he begins the Sermon on the Mount saying, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are those who are persecuted. They will be taken care of. God will take care of them. Blessed are those who have insults hurled at them and hatred, persecution in my name. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I've got you, Jesus is saying. But can we just agree that's a very different sermon than what the world gives you? Do we line up? I mean, peace, yeah. But do we want to hunger and thirst for righteousness or our ambition? Do we really want to mourn? Do we want to be meek? I mean, are the Kansas City Chiefs and the Philadelphia Eagles going to run out today and go, let's be meek? It's not going to get you anywhere on a football field, but Jesus' kingdom is upside down. Blessed are those who are persecuted. Blessed are those who make peace. Not just keep peace, but they make peace. Blessed, happy are those. And so there's this weight in putting it in context where we need to understand. Let me show you a picture of Tolstoy, who wrote War and Peace. Arguably, he's Russia's most famous novelist. And his personal life, though, he studied the life of Jesus. He read the Sermon on the Mount, and he saw in the Sermon on the Mount these very high standards. Who can live that way? Remember the next part, but you have heard it said, but I say, you have heard it said, don't murder, but I say, don't even be angry toward a brother. You have heard it said, don't commit adultery, but I say, don't even lust after a woman in your heart. You have heard it said, on and on and on. Jesus uses these strong language. And Tolstoy, the author of War and Peace, he saw in the Sermon on the Mount only a high standard. That's all he saw. Matthew 5:20. You know, the scribes and Pharisees, they did everything right. They're praying, they're giving, they're fasting. They went over and beyond with their righteousness and their deeds. But he says in Matthew 5:20, part of the Sermon on the Mount, unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will no way enter the kingdom of heaven. What a weight. How about this? If that's not clear, Matthew 5:48, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Can anybody meet that? Can anybody, I mean, is that a crushing weight for us? And Tolstoy read it like so many of us read the Sermon on the Mount and said, it's just too cumbersome. I cannot do this. He only saw the high standards. He left home close to insanity. He was suicidal. He ended up dying at a rural train station. His wife and the mother of his 13 children would say this. Sophia Tolstoy would say this. There's so little genuine warmth about him. His kindness does not come from his heart, but merely from his principles. His biographies will tell of how he helped laborers to carry buckets of water, but no one will ever know that he never gave his wife a rest and never in all these 32 years gave his child a drink of water, spent 5 minutes by his bedside to give me a chance to rest a little from all of my labors. These aren't principles. This is not a moralistic code. This is something to capture us, but not by high standards, because high standards really don't change your heart. I know it pumps us up, and we give each other pep talks about high standards, but all of us fail. All of us fall short of this, and there's this crushing weight. A.N. Wilson would say this, one of the biographers, one of the many biographies on Tolstoy's life, picking it up mid-sentence, he had a fundamental inability to understand the incarnation. His religion was ultimately a thing of law rather than of grace, a scheme for human betterment rather than a vision of God penetrating a fallen world. We'll leave that up. We can hear Jesus And while we're hearing Jesus, the teacher, we miss Jesus, the Savior. Let me show you another Russian novelist that was at the top of his game as well. He wrote, Dostoevsky wrote Crime and Punishment. Do you know he followed Jesus and he wrote about his grappling and wrestling with the Sermon on the Mount. And he didn't just see high standards. He saw the perfect Savior. He saw someone who calls us to live differently, but inwardly can change our hearts to give us what we need to be able to live differently. Please don't read this passage, this parable, and think, wise person and foolish person, and the difference is doing. Okay, we're right so far, so I'm going to do, and I'm going to do, and I'm going to do. Because if you put this in context and you see all that Jesus is saying, you can't do that. You can't do that. You're going to fall short. And as we begin to close, it makes me appreciate the writings of Philip Yancey. Have any of you read What's So Amazing About Grace? Let me cue you in with these words of truth if you might need to read this book or might want to read this book. Philip Yancey grew up in a spiritually abusive home. Any of you? He grew up in a spiritually abusive church. Church hurt before we had the term for it. But he discovered God's grace. And he writes this in What's So Amazing About Grace. For years I'd felt so unworthy before the absolute ideals of the Sermon on the Mount that I'd missed in it any notion of grace. I went back and found that the message of grace gushed through the entire speech. It begins with the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the mourning, the meek. Blessed are the desperate. It moves towards the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our debts. Deliver us from the evil one. Jesus began this great sermon with gentle words for those in need and continued on with a prayer that has formed a model for 12-step recovery programs. One day at a time, say the alcoholics in AA. Give us this day our daily bread, say the Christians. Grace is for the desperate, the needy, the broken, those who cannot make it on their own. Grace is for all of us. For years I had thought of the Sermon on the Mount as a blueprint for human behavior that no one could possibly follow. Reading it again, I found that Jesus gave these words not to cumber us, but to tell us what God is like. Whew. It's hard to do to ask all of us, including me, to fundamentally change the way we read the Bible. But these stories are not moralistic codes for our behavior. You got that in there, but this tells us what God's like. So I want to ask you, what's God like? Y'all go ahead and make your way up. We got baptism in just a second, but make your way up if you would. What's God like? He's telling you that you can be free. He's telling you that your amount of doing is not going to work your way to Him. He wants us to know there's a God who came down to us. And man, when I am bathed in His grace, not the law condemns me. The law, Galatians 3, is a schoolmaster to show me that I fall short. When Jesus says, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect, He knows what He's doing. He's got my attention, and I'm sensing that my fallenness before Him. And so what? I become more desperate. But that desperation, we only hear the word when we know we're at the end of ourselves. If church ain't your thing and the preacher is not moving you, it could be the preacher. I'm not a very good one. But you won't really hear the gospel. You won't respond to the gospel, and some of us haven't. You won't respond to the gospel until you're desperate. C.S. Lewis had a counterpart, a really smart, intellectual guy across the pond. And he came to the end of himself. A lot of doubt, a lot of uncertainty. I pastor some of you and talk to you about your doubts. I share with you my own, point you to how to nourish your faith. Here's what this writer said, Sheldon Van Auken. It's like I was standing on this cliff and over there was Jesus, but to get to Him, I'd have to take a leap of faith, which I didn't want to do. But when I looked down, I realized that the cliff I was standing on was also crumbling. I had no choice. I could jump out to something that seemed uncertain or stay standing on something even more uncertain. Either way, it was a choice. Remember when Jesus said something to the disciples and they're like, He's like, you really want to follow me? And they were like, where else can we go? And can I tell you, that's a really beautiful place to be. Some of you are scared about what the storms are revealing in your life. It is a tension getting in it, the disruption. When you're doing construction and you have this disruption and it reveals what is the foundation of your life. But I want to ask you, that pain of being revealed, when your foundation is revealed, what you've really been trusting in, what you don't want to live without, who your Savior really is. There's two types of pain. One is the pain of facing that reality. It hurts, doesn't it? So many times in my life, God's doing a work in me, a work of sanctification. As I've been in Jesus Christ, I'm secure. The gospel's got me. No one can pluck me from the Father's hand. That's how secure I am. Not because of me, but because of Him. No love like it. But I'm wrestling with my own sanctification. And I have to face some hard reality, and it's painful. It hurts. But there's another kind of pain, and it's the pain of hiding, the pain of denying. And so in this story, Jesus is a part of, I love this. I don't know if you ever realize this. Jesus gives us some important pairings in Matthew chapter 7. There are two gates, two trees, two responses, two foundations. This is the end of these pairings. And so like this writer, this friend of Lewis's, there's a choice that we all have to make. What gate will we enter? What tree will our lives be like? What response will we give? Will we be among the tribe? Because there will be ultimately a great revealing. It'll be final. It'll be full. It will be over when we give account of the construction of our houses. And what will Jesus say to us? And the two foundations, what we're building our lives on.